More than half a century of rock and roll is inside this gentleman here, Sandy Gennaro, joining us on the Reinvention Chronicles. Thanks so much for inviting us into your home, your studio, your world of, let's see, Cyndi Lauper, Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, Johnny Winter, Bo Diddley, the Monkees. I could go on and on and on, Sandy. What an incredible experience you've had collecting all these rock and roll memories and providing the backbeat for still some of the stars we listen to today.
Thank you very much, Garrett. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
And so the story goes, and I don't know how many people would remember this, depending on who's watching, but it was Ringo Starr, I think you were telling me, that really was the guy. You were growing up in New York, and you saw Ringo, and that changed your world.
Absolutely. What's the year, Ed Sullivan?
1964?
1964.
Yeah.
I remember it well. CBS, Channel 2, New York City. I remember it.
And then what happens? You see Ringo doing his thing with the Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, of course, and then...
Well, I've had an interest in the drums since I was age 3. I have pictures to bear that out. But when I saw Ringo actually playing a drum set on TV with and how the girls reacted to that music, I decided, well, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. That's where I made the lifelong commitment right there.
And so you worked in a series of bands, but the biggest break, from what I understand, was the whole Cyndi Lauper gig, this completely unknown, and it was just at the right time with the start of MTV and all that.
Absolutely. It had to do with meeting the person that was to become Cyndi Lauper's manager 3 years before on another gig. I met him moving outside, emanating outside my dressing room. He was standing there. He asked me some questions. I was very polite to him. I gave him my home number to keep in touch and whatever. And 3 years later, he became Cyndi Lauper's manager. And that's how he got in touch with me, because he remembered the time that I was very friendly with him and didn't blow him off in the doorway of that dressing room.
And that's one of the things that I think is so interesting about you, Sandy, is you've, over the years of rock and roll fame and all that goes with it, you've always had the touch with the common guy or the common person. And consequently, this guy, David, as it turns out, was
Right.
someone. Tell us a little bit about that story, because David could have been anyone. He was just an otherwise ordinary fan. And yet, what'd you do? I mean,
well, as the story goes, I was playing a gig in Connecticut. It was very crowded and very hot, and the gig was over, and the band was in a very, very big hurry to get out of there because we had a long drive. So after the show, I was busy changing and trying to get out of the dressing room, and this man was in the dressing room doorway, actually preventing me from leaving, saying, "Oh, I loved your show." He was like a fan. And he was also a bass player, and he asked me to try to get him some gigs. And I said, well, listen, I don't really have time to talk to you now. I asked him what his name was, and he said, it's David. And I said, here's my card. Call me. He could not believe I gave him my home number. And he did call me. I turned him on to some auditions in New York City. He never really got any, but we became phone friends. And 3 years later, I get a call from this man, David, saying, I'm managing this girl. We just signed her to Epic Portrait. Come down. We want your backbeat in this band, is the word he uses. And to promote her forthcoming record. And the artist was Cyndi Lauper.
And the record was She's So Unusual, which, of course, skyrocketed up the charts.
Correct.
But it was also a great moment in rock and roll history that I think is so relevant for the subject that we explore on the Reinvention Chronicles, which is, things like disruptive change. And I can't think of, in terms of disruptive change, MTV must have totally changed the game when that sort of came, onto the scene. And how artists reacted.
Basically, in 1983, when MTV emanated and began, it was the stars are aligned, because you have now an artist like Cyndi Lauper with the hair and the squeaky voice and the great songs. The songs were the vehicle to take, and the video. All aligned at the same time, and it was MTV was a tremendous reason why Cyndi Lauper and an artist like that becomes successful.
I like to say adapt or perish. It's your choice.
That's correct.
How many musicians adapted and embraced MTV? How many musicians said, I can't change?
Right, because it was a new frontier, and you adapt to change and become comfortable with the change, or you're left to the side of the road while the rest of the caravan takes off takes off up that highway.
And really, I think if there's some fundamental lessons from what you saw back in that MTV era, and then of course Cindy, and then which led to subsequent gigs for you with the Pat Travers Band, and on and on and on and on. What would you say were some fundamental principles that still exist today? Because now, as you know, people are having difficulty in the music business or any business adapting to things around the internet.
Right. Well, from a drummer standpoint, I always approached any gig as serving the artist that I worked for. You know, I was always in a spirit of service, always in a spirit of making that artist's job easier. So that's basically what got me gigs, and what not only got me certain gigs, but kept the gig for as long as I did. And it's one of the reasons why I'm still in touch with every artist I ever work with, and every manager that I ever work with, still to this day. It's just a spirit of service, and people notice that and feed off that. And another key element was, even though you're playing with the same artist, the same songs, every single night, sometimes in the same order, it's really easy to what we call it in. In other words, just not have enthusiasm when you play. You're just playing the part, doing the minimum amount to get by that evening. Well, I never call it in, because every night I look at every gig as my last gig, and I always play with a tremendous amount of enthusiasm. And because of that enthusiasm, playing Cyndi Lauper's show, Joan Jett was in the audience on one of those shows. And 5 years later, after that tour, well, I remember that guy with Cyndi Lauper. He played blah, 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 blah. And that's how I got the Joan Jett gig. And that's the way it is. One gig leads to the next. 50 years ago, I didn't have a destination in mind. All I knew is that I wanted to play drums. And one thing leads to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. All right, so first one regular, second one is the stop time, third one regular, out. 2.
Absolutely love what you just said there, Sandy, about the timelessness. In other words, no matter how much the technology changes, things like the spirit of service and a sense of enthusiasm for what you do, even if it's repetitive work, like the same songs over and over again, like Deep Purple playing Smoke on the Water, 10,000 times,
right.
Okay? But no, those things never go away. And so one of the things, again, in the spirit of reinvention, you're actually taking some of these lifelong lessons from the world of rock and roll, from performing at very high levels in front of sold out stadiums and arenas, and now you're taking it onto the stage in a professional speaking career, and you're working with companies and corporations and associations to inspire them to figure out how to apply what you learned in the world of rock and roll.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I got to hear that story.
Well, you know what? It's a bit of serendipity, because it's like the universe holds for all of us a tremendous, infinite amount of possibilities that each of us as human beings have no idea exist. And one of those possibilities manifested in a sense where after my concerts, I always throw drumsticks out to the audience, and I usually choose little children or handicapped people. And after one such show, I threw out a drumstick, and it went to a handicapped woman in a wheelchair. Her husband is a professional speaker. He contacted me the next day with his gratitude of how I made his wife's life better, how I made her happy, because nobody ever pays attention to her in a wheelchair or whatever. And he invited me to hear him speak here in Nashville one day, and I went and met him and had a coffee with the husband of the lady in the wheelchair. And he gave a speaking engagement here in Nashville, and I met him for coffee prior to it, and I told him some stories of how I got certain gigs. And from that basis, he suggested that I be tell the story, because the lessons learned from some of these stories are very, very valuable to anyone, regardless of what business they're in. And that led me on a journey to be a professional speaker. Since then, this gentleman, Antarctic Mike Pierce, the speaker I'm talking about, introduced me to Gare Maxwell. And between the expertise of those two gentlemen, I've embarked on a speaking career that I had no idea I was going to be eligible for or be able to do. The thought never entered my mind. But just telling a story of how I got certain gigs to Antarctic Mike, he suggested I become a speaker, and I've already done, quite a few speaking gigs, and I'm just at the beginning of it right now. But I look forward to embracing that and moving forward with that.
And one of the things, I got to say this before we wrap up, one of the things I love is that you've taken the same passion for rock and roll, you've put it into the speaking business, and you actually have some curriculum, some rock solid concepts, and of course it's all around the concept of beats. Tell us a little bit before we wrap up about beats, what it means, and why it's relevant to anyone watching you today.
Well, the name of my presentation is Beating the Drums and Beating the Odds in Music, Business, and in Life, and that'll be the title of the eventual book. But I used an acronym as a guide in my presentation, and the acronym is the word BEATS, and that stands for belief, enthusiasm, attitude, tenacity, and service. And I demonstrate with some of the lessons I've learned in the music business and how using those 5 attributes, how it applies to corporate, how it applies to education, college students, universities, corporate, and even as down to family, how you have long-term relationships with your wife, with your boyfriend, with your live-in lover, your significant other, whoever that may be. If you apply this to living your life, you will have a very successful life, and you will be happy. Everybody wants to be happy. That's the goal. And one little word of advice is not to look at your goal in life as to be the pinnacle. Like when you reach this goal, all questions will be answered. You will be totally happy. It's the journey that you should relish day by day by day. That's why I relish each gig that I do, because you never know when it's going to be done. And if you look at the pinnacle, if you reach the top of Everest, it's like when you climb Everest and you reach the top, well, there's nothing really else to go to. So what are you going to do? You go back down the other side of the hill. But if you look at the life as your life journey as success is in the journey and not in the destination.
Well, he's got, like I say, Sandy, you could go on and on and on. No question, you were cut out to be a professional speaker, to go from behind the drum kit to take center stage. And listen, you've been providing the backbeat for some of the greatest musicians that we ever get to hear. And now, thank you so much for providing the backbeat here on the Reinvention Chronicles.
Well, it's my pleasure, Gare Maxwell. Thank you so much for having me.
Sandy Gennaro, look out for it. Beating the drums and beating the odds in business and in life and
music.
And thank you for that. And hopefully some of these ideas will help you recreate and reimagine the business, the career, the life that you deserve.